What would you do if you discovered your wife's secret affair and then found out your child might not even be yours? Betrayal, deception, and the fight of a lifetime unfold in this emotional roller coaster. Watch as one man faces the ultimate test of trust, love, and revenge. Will he fight for his family, or will the truth destroy everything? Stay tuned to see how far he'll go. Where will you stand when the truth finally comes out? Jim Collins had always prided himself on his perfect life. At 38, he had built a successful career as a software engineer, married his college sweetheart Rachel, and had a beautiful 4-year-old son. To the outside world, they were the picture of happiness, a family living the American dream. But recently, cracks had started to form, subtle at first, then becoming more impossible to ignore. It started with Rachel's late nights. It wasn't unusual for her to work late as a freelance fashion designer. But this was different. Jim found himself sitting at the dinner table alone more often than not. The house was quieter, and Rachel's once vibrant smile seemed a little more forced each day. She became more distant, lost in her own world, and Jim couldn't help but feel like an outsider in his own home. One evening, he stayed up later than usual, waiting for her. She'd texted earlier, saying she was meeting a client, but it was after 9 p.m. when she still hadn't come home. Jim stared at the clock on the wall, tapping his fingers nervously. His mind wandered, replaying the last few weeks, her distractedness, the excuses, the missed calls and messages on her phone that she quickly swiped away whenever he was near. But he brushed it off as nothing. He trusted Rachel, didn't he? When Rachel finally came home, it was with a forced cheerfulness. Her face was flushed, her hair tousled, as though she had been rushing. "I'm sorry, babe, the client ran late. I didn't expect to be out this long," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched, a little too defensive. Jim smiled and nodded, though his gut twisted. He was tired of second-guessing himself, tired of the doubts creeping in. But tonight, something in his chest told him it was more than just a late meeting. As Rachel moved through the house, Jim noticed her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. He caught a glimpse of the name, Carlos. Jim froze. Carlos Martinez, a name he didn't recognize. His heart skipped a beat. Was it a coincidence, or was it the beginning of something else? He picked up the phone, his hands shaking. He debated whether to check the messages, but his curiosity won. It wasn't like him to invade her privacy, but something told him he had to know. The text was short, but it stung. "Can't wait to see you this weekend. Let's make it unforgettable." Jim's chest tightened. He put the phone back where it had been, silently retreating to the living room. His mind raced. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a business connection. But deep down, he knew. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Rachel came into the room a few minutes later, her smile fading as she saw the look on his face. "Jim, what's wrong?" For a moment he wanted to say nothing, to act like everything was fine. But instead he opened his mouth and heard himself say the words he'd been afraid to speak. "I saw the messages, Rachel." "Who's Carlos?" Her face turned pale, the color draining from her cheeks. Her mouth opened, but no words came out at first. She looked down at the floor, avoiding his gaze. "It's not what you think, Jim," she whispered, but the tremor in her voice told him everything he needed to know. Jim stood up, his hands clenched into fists. He had been a fool to ignore it for so long, to trust her when all along the cracks had been widening, unnoticed. "Then tell me what it is, Rachel. Because right now, I don't know what to believe anymore." Jim had always trusted Rachel without question, but now every minute spent in the same room felt like a war zone. The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. His mind refused to let go of the moment he'd seen Carlos's name on Rachel's phone. He couldn't shake the image of that message, the casual intimacy of it all, a reminder of how little he truly knew. It was late, well past midnight, when Rachel had finally fallen asleep beside him. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Jim lay still, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Rachel's text message replayed in his mind, and every time his stomach twisted a little more. He couldn't let it go. He had to know. Gently, he slid out of bed, careful not to wake her. The soft glow of the kitchen light illuminated the room as he walked toward the living room. His heart raced as he pulled out his phone, unlocking it and staring at the message from Carlos again. He quickly scanned the text. "Can't wait to see you this weekend. Let's make it unforgettable." Jim swallowed hard. His mind screamed that it had to be more than business, more than a casual friend. His fingers hovered over his phone, shaking slightly. He'd always trusted Rachel, but this felt like betrayal, like a crack in the foundation that had held their relationship together for years. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his hand. Startled, Jim quickly glanced at the screen, seeing Rachel's name flash before him. He froze, unsure whether to answer, but the ringing kept pulling him in. After a few moments, he pressed the green button and brought the phone to his ear. "Hello? Jim?" Rachel's voice came through, hesitant and soft. Where are you?" Jim cut her off, his voice colder than he intended. He immediately regretted the sharpness, but couldn't bring himself to soften it. "I'm at the office, working late," she replied, the same excuse she'd given him countless times before. "I told you about the project. It's just a bit overwhelming tonight." Jim's grip on the phone tightened, his pulse quickening. It wasn't her voice that sent a chill through him. It was the fact that the words felt rehearsed, too smooth, too practiced. "You're at the office?" Jim repeated, barely holding back the sarcasm. "Then why did you just answer your phone so quickly? It's not like you to be checking in." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. He could hear Rachel breathing softly, but there was something off, something that made him question every word she said. I don't know what you mean," Rachel finally said, her voice strained. "I'm just trying to get this project done, Jim. Why are you acting like this? I told you I was busy." He could hear the flicker of hesitation in her words, but Jim couldn't let it go. The doubts in his mind were too loud now. He wasn't the fool she thought he was. He wasn't the naive man he had been hours ago. He couldn't pretend everything was okay. "Tell me the truth, Rachel," Jim said, his voice low but firm. "Tell me what's going on." Another silence. This time it lasted longer, and when Rachel spoke again it was barely above a whisper. I can't talk about this right now. I'll explain everything when I get home." Jim exhaled slowly, the hurt and frustration flooding back to him. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already 1 a.m. There was no office project. She wasn't at work. "You're not at the office, Rachel," Jim said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "I know about the messages. I know about Carlos." Rachel's breath hitched on the other end of the line. For a moment there was complete silence, dead silence, as if the world itself had paused. Jim could hear the faint rustle of movement, maybe Rachel setting the phone down, maybe something else. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling. "Jim, please, I can't explain right now. Just trust me, okay?" But Jim was done trusting her without answers. He had seen enough to know there were no more lies left to hide. "No, Rachel, I can't trust you anymore." He hung up. The morning after the phone call was a blur. Jim hadn't slept a wink, his mind replaying the conversation with Rachel over and over. Every word, every hesitation cut deeper than the last. The silence after he'd hung up was deafening, and yet the pain still rang in his ears, louder than any words. His trust had been shattered, and there was no going back. By the time Rachel came home later that afternoon, Jim had already made up his mind. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. He couldn't keep avoiding the truth. He had to confront her. No more waiting, no more doubts. He'd found the courage to face the lies head on, no matter how much it hurt. When Rachel walked through the door, she didn't seem surprised. Her eyes darted around the room nervously, as if she knew something was off, but she didn't speak. She set down her purse and took a hesitant step forward, her face a mixture of guilt and confusion. "Jim?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. "I know we need to talk, but—" "No, Rachel," Jim cut her off, his voice cold and firm. "I don't want any more excuses. I want the truth." Rachel's face paled. She opened her mouth to respond, but Jim raised his hand to stop her. He couldn't let her control this anymore. "You lied to me. You've been lying for weeks, months even. I know about Carlos. I know everything." The words felt like daggers, but Jim didn't flinch. Rachel froze, her eyes widening in shock, a look of fear creeping onto her face. "Jim, please, just let me explain." "No." His voice was sharp, almost angry now. "I've seen the texts, Rachel. I've seen the way you look at your phone, the way you try to hide things from me. How long were you planning to keep this from me?" She stood there, silent, her eyes cast down as if she couldn't bear to meet his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation pressed down on both of them, thick and suffocating. "I never meant for it to happen," Rachel whispered, finally speaking, but her voice lacked conviction. "It was just... I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want to hurt you." Jim clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the anger bubbling up, but he pushed it down. He wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. "You didn't know how to stop it?" he repeated bitterly. "What, so you just let it happen? You think I'm that stupid, Rachel? I trusted you with everything." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, trying to hold back her emotions. "I'm sorry, Jim. I really am. I didn't think it would go this far. Carlos, he just made me feel alive again. I thought it was nothing. I thought I could fix things later." Jim stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Fix things later? You're talking about cheating on me with someone else, and you think it's something you can just fix? You think I'll just forgive you because you're sorry?" His voice cracked, and for the first time, he let himself feel the hurt, the devastation, the betrayal. Rachel's shoulders trembled and her voice broke. "I never wanted to hurt you like this. I love you, Jim. I always have. But I've been feeling so alone for so long. I don't know what happened. It wasn't supposed to be like this." Jim shook his head, fighting back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Alone?" he spat, bitterness lacing his words. "You've been seeing Carlos behind my back, and you're telling me you were alone. You think I don't see what's really happening?" Rachel collapsed onto the couch, her hands covering her face in shame. Jim stood there staring at her, trying to make sense of everything. But it was all a blur now. The life they'd built, the trust they'd shared, shattered in an instant. For a long moment, the silence stretched between them. Jim could feel his world slipping further out of his grasp. His heart ached, and his mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of which made any sense anymore. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want me to do, Jim? What can I do to fix this?" Jim stood frozen, his gaze fixed on her, but his heart already making its decision. There was no fixing this, no going back to the way things were. The betrayal was too deep, the lies too many. "I don't know," Jim whispered, the weight of the words heavy on his chest. "But I know I can't keep living this lie." The confrontation between Jim and Rachel had left a jagged wound in both of their hearts, but Jim knew he wasn't finished yet. The truth was still hiding, buried beneath layers of half-formed apologies and evasions. Rachel's confession, though painful, felt incomplete, like she was withholding something much darker than a mere affair. Jim sat in the living room, the weight of the situation pulling him deeper into a spiral of suspicion and doubt. His mind couldn't stop racing, replaying Rachel's words over and over. "I never meant for it to happen." But how could he believe that? How could any of it be a mistake when the evidence had been staring him in the face for so long? He needed answers, real answers, not the half-baked excuses Rachel had been offering. The following morning, Jim made a decision. He wasn't going to let her control the narrative any longer. He called a private investigator. The investigator was discreet, a middle-aged man named Mark who had dealt with situations like Jim's before. Mark agreed to take on the case, promising to uncover the truth Jim needed to hear, no matter how ugly. It wasn't long before Mark reported back. The findings were devastating. The affair was just the beginning. The first lie, it seemed, was much bigger than Jim had anticipated. "Mr. Collins, I've got some information you need to see," Mark said, handing him a folder. Jim's hands trembled as he opened it, expecting to find more evidence of Rachel and Carlos's affair, but instead it was worse, much worse. The file contained bank statements, credit card records, and emails, evidence of Rachel's secret financial activity. Jim's eyes widened as he processed the numbers, the amount of money Rachel had quietly been stashing away in a secret account. It was clear now. This wasn't just about a betrayal of love. It was a betrayal of trust, of their entire life together. Rachel had been preparing to leave Jim long before he had any idea what was going on. The cold realization hit Jim like a punch to the gut. Not only had she been cheating, but she had been planning her escape from him, calculating every move, every dollar she needed to make sure she could walk away with everything she wanted. Carlos, the money, and the security of a life without him. Jim felt sick to his stomach. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had spent the last decade with, had been plotting to tear their life apart. All along, while he had been working, trusting her with everything, she had been quietly preparing her exit strategy. The revelation made his heart ache in ways he hadn't known were possible. He immediately confronted Rachel. She was sitting in the kitchen, sipping coffee as if everything were normal. Jim slammed the folder down on the table in front of her, watching her face as she looked at the evidence. Her eyes flickered with guilt, but she quickly masked it, her usual calm demeanor faltering. "Jim, Don't lie to me," Jim interrupted, his voice sharp. "I know about the money. I know you've been hiding everything from me." Rachel's face went pale, the mask she'd been wearing slipping completely. "Jim, I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought it was better this way." "Better?" Jim's voice was thick with disbelief. "You thought it was better to plan an escape behind my back? To take everything we built and destroy it?" Rachel stood up, her hands trembling. "I didn't want to leave you. I didn't want this to happen. But I felt trapped, Jim. I needed more than you could give me." Jim couldn't believe his ears. "More? More than what? The love I gave you? The family we built? The life we had?" Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she tried to explain herself. "It wasn't about you. It was about me. I was suffocating. I thought I could fix everything. But I was wrong, Jim. I was so wrong." Jim could barely look at her. He wasn't sure if it was the betrayal of her love or the complete destruction of their trust that hurt more. Both felt like a weight he couldn't bear. "Do you even love me anymore, Rachel?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, and Rachel's silence spoke volumes. She didn't answer, and Jim didn't need her to. He already knew. The first lie had been the hardest to uncover, but now it was clear. The truth about Rachel's betrayal was far deeper than he could have imagined. Jim stared at the folder in his hands, his heart racing. It felt as if the walls were closing in around him. The evidence Rachel had kept hidden, the money, the secret life, was enough to tear anyone apart. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the nagging question that had been eating at him for days. Was his son really his? He hadn't dared ask Rachel. Not yet. But the moment that message from Carlos flashed on her phone, the moment he saw the betrayal with his own eyes, the doubt was planted in his mind. He couldn't shake it. The child he had raised for 4 years, the boy who called him Dad, was he really his? Jim had always prided himself on being a rational man, someone who faced problems head-on. But this was different. This was his family. His trust had been shattered. And now, even the one thing he thought was pure was being questioned. He looked down at the test kit that lay in front of him on the kitchen table. The decision weighed heavily on him. Was it better to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt, or to keep living in uncertainty? He had always believed that blood meant everything, but now, after everything Rachel had done, could he even trust her with something as sacred as the truth about his son? Rachel was still asleep upstairs, unaware of what Jim was about to do. She had no idea that he had already begun to unravel the lies she'd carefully woven. He knew the test wasn't just about confirming paternity. It was about finding closure, about taking control of his life again. He wasn't sure what he would do if the test came back negative. Could he still be a father to a child that wasn't his? Could he look at him and feel the same love? Or would the truth destroy him completely? The thought of losing everything, his family, his role as a father, was unbearable. But what hurt more was the realization that he couldn't trust anything anymore, not even the love he had for his own child. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up, startled. It was Mark, the private investigator. The man had been keeping an eye on Rachel's movements and had gathered more evidence than Jim could have imagined. Jim hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to know the full extent of Rachel's betrayal, but now, standing in front of him, Mark was about to deliver the next part of the truth. "Mr. Collins," Mark said, his voice calm and businesslike, "I've got everything you asked for. It's all here." He handed over a thick stack of documents. Jim took the papers, his hands trembling as he opened them. Mark continued, "I did some digging into Rachel's past, into her finances, into Carlos, and I found something that I think you should know." Jim's heart pounded. The investigator's words felt like a slow, deliberate countdown. Mark's expression was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, something that told Jim that this wasn't just about a simple affair anymore. It was something deeper. Mark paused for a moment before continuing. "I found evidence of multiple accounts linked to Carlos, but there's something more. Rachel had been planning to leave you. She was preparing to take the child with her." The words hit Jim like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just lies. It was a plan, a deliberate escape. Jim sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his breath coming in shallow gasps. She was going to leave me," he whispered. Mark nodded. "She had already set things in motion, Jim. She was preparing for a future with Carlos, and that meant taking your son. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but it's the truth." The room spun. Everything he thought he knew was a lie. Rachel had been planning her escape, planning to take everything from him, his wife, his child, his future. The feeling of betrayal was so sharp it was almost physical, and yet the pain of the truth was still to come. Jim stood up, the weight of Mark's words pressing down on him. His mind was a whirlpool of anger, confusion, and disbelief. But beneath it all, there was a clear sense of resolve forming. He had to do the DNA test. He had to know. No more lies, no more half-truths. "Thank you, Mark," Jim said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "I need to do this. I need to know if he's mine." Mark nodded and walked out, leaving Jim alone in the silence of the kitchen, the test kit still sitting in front of him. Jim stared at it, the final step in his journey toward the truth. He wasn't sure what the test would reveal, but he knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter, staring at Jim like an ominous presence. It was thick, sterile, and cold, the kind of letter that no one ever hopes to receive. He had put it off for days, the DNA test results that would either confirm his worst fears or provide him with the clarity he desperately needed. Now, with the house eerily quiet, it was time to open it. He couldn't take it anymore. The lies, the doubt. His whole world had unraveled over the past few days, piece by painful piece, and this was the last piece of the puzzle. Jim could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. His breath was shallow, his fingers shaking as he reached for the envelope. Opening it felt like peeling away the last shred of his dignity, exposing the raw, vulnerable truth underneath. He pulled out the test results and scanned the bold words that seemed to burn into his soul. "The biological father of the child is not Mr. Jim Collins." His eyes blurred as the words on the page became a blur. It took a few moments for the full weight of the revelation to sink in. The boy he had raised, the child he had loved as his own for 4 years, was not his. The pain in his chest was unlike anything he had ever felt. He had always been certain in the deepest part of his heart that the boy was his. And now, the foundation of that certainty had crumbled. Jim sat down at the kitchen table, his legs too weak to support him. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. But the truth was clear. The child, the son he had believed was his flesh and blood, had been a lie. Rachel's betrayal had gone deeper than he ever imagined. The affair with Carlos wasn't just about infidelity. It was about taking something sacred, his family, and using it for her own selfish needs. She had built a life with him under false pretenses. Every laugh, every kiss, every moment they had shared with their son now felt like a cruel joke. But even worse, Jim realized, was the silence that followed. Rachel hadn't come home yet, and for the first time, Jim wondered if she ever would. Had she known all along? Did she know that Carlos was the father of their son? The thought of it made Jim sick to his stomach. The door opened behind him, but Jim didn't turn around. He knew who it was. Rachel stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes searching his for any sign of what was coming. She was the picture of vulnerability, her shoulders slumped, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. But Jim didn't care. His anger, his hurt, his confusion had all taken root, and now he was ready to face her. He had no more room for doubt. "Jim," she asked hesitantly, "what's wrong?" Jim didn't answer immediately. He simply held up the letter, the words written in black and white, mocking him. Rachel's eyes widened as she saw the test results, and for a moment the woman who had hidden behind excuses and lies looked like she had seen a ghost. "Jim, I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" Jim echoed, standing up slowly, his voice barely containing the fury inside. "How long were you planning on hiding this from me, Rachel? How long were you going to let me think I was the father?" Rachel opened her mouth, but the words faltered. She took a step toward him, but Jim held up his hand, stopping her in her tracks. "No, don't. I've heard enough of your excuses," Jim said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion so raw it felt like it was suffocating him. "You lied to me for years, Rachel. I trusted you. I loved you. And you took that trust and trampled it." Rachel began, but her voice cracked and she dropped her gaze to the floor. "I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt you, Jim." "Don't say that," Jim snapped, his voice sharp like glass breaking. "You hurt me more than you can imagine. You've taken everything, my trust, my family, my heart, and turned it into something I can't even recognize." There was silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was suffocating, heavy with unspoken words. Jim stood there staring at her, his chest rising and falling with each breath, as if the weight of the truth was pressing on him harder than ever. Rachel looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Jim. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I was lost, and Carlos, he made me feel like I mattered again. But I never wanted to lose you." "I'm not the one you lost, Rachel," Jim said quietly, his voice trembling now, despite his best efforts to keep control. "You lost everything when you made the choice to betray me." Rachel's sobs filled the room as she collapsed into a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jim's anger still burned, but it wasn't enough to erase the overwhelming sadness that had replaced everything else. This was the truth now. There was no more pretending, and no matter how much Rachel cried, no matter how many apologies she offered, Jim knew this would be the last time they would ever have a chance at the life they once had. The weeks that followed Rachel's confession were a blur of legal documents, meetings with attorneys, and endless sleepless nights. Jim had never imagined he would find himself here, fighting for the custody of his son, for his right to be a father. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, and now he was left struggling to keep his balance. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed to slip back into her role of calm and composed, as though the devastation she had caused had never existed. She immediately hired her own attorney, someone skilled at twisting words and manipulating the truth. Jim knew that this wasn't going to be a clean, easy process. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about winning back everything he had lost. The first meeting with his attorney, Kara, was a cold shock to reality. She was a no-nonsense woman in her mid-30s with a sharp, calculating mind. She wasted no time getting down to business. "We need to be prepared for a fight," Kara said, leaning across the table, her hands clasped together in front of her. "Rachel is going to claim that you're emotionally unstable, that this whole situation is clouding your judgment. She's going to play the victim, Jim, and she has Carlos on her side." Jim's jaw clenched as he thought of Carlos, the man who had stolen his wife, his family, his trust. The thought of him being in the courtroom, trying to undermine everything Jim had worked for, made his blood boil. "We have to counter that," Kara continued. "We need to show the court that you're the better parent, that you have the right to raise your child. It's going to be difficult, but you can't let Rachel manipulate the situation." Jim nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure he could handle what was coming. He had never been the type of person to fight in a courtroom. He had never imagined his life would come to this. The days turned into weeks, and the tension continued to build. Rachel remained cold, her apologies hollow and her actions inconsistent. She would occasionally try to guilt Jim into letting her off the hook, but he wasn't fooled anymore. Her plans had been set into motion long before the affair had come to light. Then came the first major court date. Jim walked into the courtroom, his heart racing, his stomach in knots. It wasn't the fear of facing Rachel. It was the fear of what might happen to his son. His mind kept circling back to the one question that he hadn't been able to escape. Could he still be the father to a child who wasn't his? Would the court see his love for the boy he had raised as something that mattered? As the proceedings began, Rachel's lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Edward, immediately launched into his strategy. He painted a picture of Jim as an angry, unstable man, unable to cope with the betrayal. He accused Jim of using the DNA test results as an excuse to push Rachel out of their son's life. Edward's words hit like daggers, each one calculated to wound Jim where it hurt the most. He tried to stay composed, tried to remind himself that this was all part of the game, but it was hard. It was hard to sit there and listen to lies about his character, to hear his love for his son being reduced to a footnote in the battle over custody. Kara spoke up next, presenting the evidence she had gathered: bank statements, text messages, and emails proving that Rachel had been hiding assets and planning to leave Jim for months. Rachel's plans had been calculated, a slow burn of betrayal that Jim had never seen coming. Kara painted Rachel as manipulative, using her son as a bargaining chip in a scheme to get out of the marriage and into a life with Carlos. Rachel's face turned red as Kara's words hit home. She had been prepared for a fight, but now it was clear that her own lies were being used against her. Jim couldn't help but feel a twisted satisfaction, seeing Rachel squirm under the weight of her own deception. But the real battle was yet to come. As the judge listened to the testimony, Jim's mind raced. He could hear the words, but they didn't seem to matter. All he cared about was being a father to his son. He had raised that boy for 4 years, and no matter what Rachel had done, Jim knew he was the one who had given that child the love and care he deserved. The court session ended without a resolution, but the seed of doubt had been planted. It wasn't over yet, but Jim felt something shift. He wasn't just fighting for custody, he was fighting for the right to keep his family intact. And as the weeks dragged on, with more court dates and more emotional battles ahead, Jim knew he would never give up. In the midst of the chaos, he found his resolve. The courtroom had been a battlefield for weeks, and Jim could feel the weariness settling in his bones. Each day felt like a weight pressing down on him, but he refused to let go. He was fighting for his son, for everything that mattered. He thought he'd seen the worst of it, the lies, the deceit, the betrayal, but the universe had one more twist in store for him. It happened during a routine meeting with Kara, his lawyer. They were reviewing some new evidence when Kara paused, her eyes narrowing as she scrolled through her phone. Jim noticed the sudden shift in her demeanor and felt a knot form in his stomach. "What is it?" Jim asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Kara's face had gone pale, and Jim could tell she wasn't about to say anything easy. She slowly placed her phone down on the table and looked at him, her expression grave. "Jim, I think you need to see this," she said, sliding the phone toward him. Jim's hands were shaking as he picked it up, not sure what he was about to find. The message on the screen was from Carlos. It wasn't what Jim had expected. It was worse. It was a text conversation, one that stretched back for months, all the way to the early days of Rachel's affair. But there was something else hidden in the messages that made Jim's blood run cold. Carlos wasn't just Rachel's lover. He was also involved in the financial schemes that had been happening behind Jim's back. There were detailed plans about how to split Jim's assets, about how to orchestrate the divorce in a way that would give Rachel and Carlos full control over the money they had stolen. There was talk of taking Jim's son, ensuring that he was kept away from Jim's life for good. The sting of the words was more painful than anything Jim had experienced so far. Not only had Rachel betrayed him with another man, but she had actively planned his destruction with the Carlos. She wasn't just unfaithful, she was a co-conspirator in a scheme to tear his life apart. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was calculated and malicious. Jim's anger flared, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, aching sadness. He had trusted Rachel with everything, his family, his life, and yet she had been working behind the scenes with Carlos to destroy everything they had built together. "What do you want to do?" Kara asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. Jim looked up from the phone, his eyes wild with hurt and fury. He was done with the lies, done with playing the victim. This wasn't just about a marriage falling apart anymore. It was about taking back control. It was about exposing the truth, no matter how ugly it was. "We go to the police," Jim said firmly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "This goes beyond a divorce. They've been conspiring against me. I'm not going to let them get away with it." Kara nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. But Jim's mind was already racing, thinking of everything he had to do. He was going to fight back, not just for custody, but for justice. He gathered himself, wiping the sweat from his palms. This was the final straw. No more half-truths, no more pretending. The truth about Rachel and Carlos would be exposed for everyone to see. Rachel had no idea what was coming. When Jim showed up at the house later that evening, he was ready for a confrontation, but this time it was different. He was not just angry, he was armed with the truth, the undeniable proof of her betrayal. Rachel was sitting on the couch when Jim walked in. The air between them felt electric, like something was about to break. "You've been lying to me for months, Rachel," Jim said, his voice shaking with anger, but also with the resolve he had finally found. "And now I know everything. I know about the money, about your plans with Carlos. It's all right here." Rachel's face turned white as Jim pulled out the phone and showed her the messages. She tried to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, Jim could see that Rachel was truly afraid. The reality of what she had done was crashing down on her. "You were going to leave me, Rachel," Jim continued, his voice growing louder. "You were going to take everything, and you thought I wouldn't find out. But I did. And now it's over." Rachel opened her mouth, her eyes desperate, but Jim held up his hand. There were no more excuses, no more apologies that could make this right. "You've betrayed me. You've betrayed our son. You're not getting away with this." Rachel stood up, her voice trembling. "Jim, please. I was lost. I didn't know what I was doing. Carlos—" "Don't," Jim interrupted. "Don't try to justify this. I'm done." As he turned to leave, Rachel's sobs echoed behind him. But they were hollow, empty. Jim knew she was broken, but so was he. He was done with the lies. He was done with Rachel. And he was going to make sure she paid for everything she had done. The courtroom had been a battleground, but Jim's real fight was about to begin in the privacy of his home. After the heated confrontation with Rachel, he had believed he'd seen the worst, but the letter, the one that had been buried in a drawer, had the power to destroy everything he thought he knew. It had been a few days since the explosive scene between them. Rachel had withdrawn into silence, no longer making excuses or pretending. She simply kept her distance, giving Jim space to process the chaos she'd caused. But Jim wasn't ready to move on. His mind constantly reeled from the betrayal, from the realization that everything in his life had been built on lies. He needed answers, but they weren't coming from Rachel. That evening, after Rachel had gone to bed, Jim decided to go through the old desk drawer where Rachel used to keep some of her personal belongings, papers, bills, and old letters. He wasn't looking for anything specific, but the nagging feeling that something important had been hidden away pushed him to dig deeper. As he sifted through the stack of papers, one letter caught his eye. It was handwritten, and although the envelope was old, it seemed strangely out of place among the other documents. It wasn't addressed to him. It wasn't even addressed to anyone he recognized. His curiosity got the better of him, and he slowly tore open the envelope. Inside, he found a letter that would forever change the course of their already shattered relationship. The letter was from Rachel to Carlos. It wasn't just a casual note. It was a confession, a roadmap to the future Rachel had envisioned for herself. She spoke openly about her intentions to leave Jim, her frustration with the life she had built with him, and how she had planned to manipulate Jim's emotions to get what she wanted. As Jim read the words, the room around him seemed to grow colder. Rachel had never been honest with him. All along, she had been planning her escape, plotting how to use their son as leverage in her escape with Carlos. She had written everything out in detail, how to make it look like Jim had abandoned her, how to secure the financial settlements, and how to manipulate the divorce to their advantage. The most painful part of the letter was the way Rachel referred to their son. She had already decided in her mind that their child would be part of her life with Carlos, that Jim would be a mere afterthought. Jim's heart sank. The bond he thought they shared as parents had been reduced to a tool of manipulation. Rachel had written, "I'm going to do this, Carlos. I can't keep living this lie with Jim. He doesn't see me anymore, but you do. I'll make sure he never suspects a thing. Our future is together, and nothing will stand in the way of that." Each word hit Jim like a blow to the chest. He had been fooled, not just by Rachel, but by a woman he thought he knew better than anyone else. His trust had been shattered completely. It wasn't just about infidelity, it was about a deliberate plan to destroy him, to take away everything he had worked so hard to build. Jim could barely breathe as he reread the letter, disbelief giving way to a searing rage. His hands trembled as he put the letter down. For a moment he didn't know what to do with the overwhelming flood of emotions coursing through him. Anger, betrayal, but most of all, sadness. This was the woman he had loved, the mother of his child. And yet she had been planning his downfall, orchestrating a future where he was nothing but a casualty in her escape with Carlos. The letter seemed like the final confirmation Jim needed. There was no more pretending. There was no way back from this. His marriage was over. His trust in Rachel was gone. But there was something else, something deeper, more terrifying. He wasn't just fighting for custody of his son anymore. He was fighting for his own dignity, for his future, and for the life he deserved. The weight of it all settled in his chest. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't let Rachel get away with what she had done, not to him, not to their child. Jim was done being the victim. It was time for Rachel to face the consequences of her actions. He stood up, walking toward the bedroom where Rachel was sleeping, unaware of the storm that was about to erupt. His mind was clear now. He knew what he had to do. Jim sat at the kitchen table, the letter still in his hands, his mind unable to quiet the storm inside. The words Rachel had written were like a dagger to his heart, but they also gave him clarity. Clarity he had never asked for but desperately needed. She had been planning her exit from him for so long, and now that the full extent of her betrayal was clear, he felt like the last shred of his soul had been ripped away. The anger that had been simmering inside him for weeks finally boiled over. This wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. This was about deceit, manipulation, and a carefully orchestrated plan to destroy everything Jim had built. His family, his trust, his future. He had no intention of confronting Rachel immediately. No, the time had come to take control of his own life. He would no longer sit back and let her control the narrative. He needed to act, fast. It wasn't until late that night, after Rachel had gone to bed, that Jim made his move. He quietly moved through the house, grabbing the documents he had kept hidden for weeks. The files that detailed every betrayal, every manipulation. It was all laid out now, proof of Rachel's deceit and her plans with Carlos. Jim knew what he had to do next. He would take this evidence to his lawyer, Kara, and make sure Rachel was held accountable. But there was one more thing he needed to do. Something personal. Something that would finally bring an end to the nightmare. As he walked to the bedroom, his heart pounded in his chest. He knew this would be the final confrontation. There would be no turning back after this. His mind kept replaying the words he had seen on the paper. "I can't keep living this lie with Jim. He doesn't see me anymore. But you do. I'll make sure he never suspects a thing. Our future is together, and nothing will stand in the way of that." Rachel was asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. Jim paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with, was a stranger now. She wasn't the person he thought she was. He had been her victim, but now he was in control. He quietly placed the documents on the dresser and then walked over to the side of the bed. He sat down, his mind racing with the weight of what he had to say. Rachel stirred, her eyes slowly opening. She blinked, trying to adjust to the dim light, and then saw Jim sitting there, his face a mixture of pain and resolve. "What's going on, Jim?" she asked, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Jim didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, his hand gripping the edge of the bed as he steadied himself. "You lied to me, Rachel," he said, his voice low but firm. "You lied about everything. About Carlos, about our son, about us. You've been planning to leave me for months, and now I know everything." Rachel's face drained of color, her eyes widening in shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jim raised his hand to stop her. "No more lies," he said, his voice sharp. "I've seen the letter. I know what you've been planning. You were going to take everything from me, Rachel. You were going to take my son, take everything I built, and leave me with nothing." Rachel's face crumpled, and for the first time in weeks, Jim saw genuine fear in her eyes. Her voice cracked as she tried to defend herself. "Jim, I didn't want it to go this far. I never meant for you to find out. I didn't know how to tell you." "Tell me?" Jim repeated bitterly. "How do you even begin to tell someone that you've been planning their destruction? You used me, Rachel. You used our son to get what you wanted." She began to cry then, her shoulders trembling with the weight of everything she had done. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was lost. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I could have both of you." Jim stood up, his chest tight with fury. "You didn't love me, Rachel. You didn't love us. You used me, and now you're going to pay for it." Rachel's sobs filled the room as she crumpled onto the bed, but Jim didn't look back. He walked toward the door, the document still sitting on the dresser, the evidence of her betrayal hanging in the air like a thick fog. He had done what he came to do. He had confronted her with the truth, and now he could move on. He wasn't the man he had been just a few months ago. That man was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who wouldn't be manipulated or deceived any longer. The last thing Jim heard as he closed the door behind him was Rachel's voice, calling out to him through the darkness, but he didn't turn around. The final betrayal had been revealed. Now, it was time to let go. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Jim sat at the defendant's table, his fingers clutched around the cold metal edges. He hadn't anticipated how hard this would be, how much this final battle would tear at him, but here he was, facing Rachel across the room, her new lawyer poised to tear him apart with every word. His heart pounded in his chest, a tightness he could not shake, but the determination in his gut kept him from faltering. The judge called the room to order, and the proceedings began. Rachel's lawyer, Edward, immediately took center stage, delivering his opening statement with practiced ease. His tone was smooth, calculated, like he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. "Your Honor, we are here today to discuss the custody of a child caught in the middle of a painful and difficult situation," Edward began, his eyes scanning the courtroom, making sure to glance briefly at Rachel, who sat with her head down, her face hidden behind a veil of feigned sorrow. "My client, Rachel Collins, is the mother of the child, and she has been nothing but a loving and caring parent, doing what any mother would do to protect her family." Jim's stomach twisted at his words. The lies, the manipulation, all wrapped up in a neat little package. The courtroom was filled with a murmur of agreement from Rachel's supporters in the back, and Jim's anger began to simmer, but he fought it back. He had to stay calm. Edward's voice dripped with sympathy. "Rachel has been through tremendous emotional distress, betrayed by her husband, and she is seeking to create a stable and loving environment for her son. Mr. Collins, on the other hand, has displayed erratic behavior, and his emotional instability is not conducive to raising a child." He turned to face the judge, the smirk barely hidden behind his professional facade. Jim could feel the weight of the accusation, but he knew it was a game, one Rachel had played for months, and now Edward was using every trick in the book to undermine him. Kara, Jim's lawyer, stood up to speak. She was ready for this. She had gathered all the evidence, the hidden financial transactions, the texts, the letter Rachel had written to Carlos. Kara had built a case that would expose everything Rachel had done. "Your Honor," Kara began, her voice strong, clear, and unwavering. "What Mr. Edward fails to mention is the deliberate, premeditated scheme Rachel Collins orchestrated to undermine her husband and manipulate the very life she created with him. We have evidence, documentation, texts, financial records, that show Rachel planned to leave her husband long before these proceedings started. She was preparing to take the child and walk away with everything." Jim's heart raced as the words cut through the air. The truth was finally coming to light. The letter Rachel had written, the financial documents that proved her deceit, the text messages with Carlos, everything was now in front of the court, undeniable. Rachel's face turned crimson, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She couldn't hide it anymore. The facade she had carefully crafted was crumbling before her eyes. Jim could see the panic in her eyes as Kara continued. We also have evidence that Rachel's intentions have never been about the well-being of the child. She was prepared to use him as leverage in her escape plan, a pawn in her game to secure her future with Carlos. Mr. Collins, despite the personal betrayal, has always been an involved father, providing love and stability for his son. It is clear that Mr. Collins is the better parent in this situation. The words echoed through the room, each one like a hammer smashing the walls Rachel had built around her lies. Jim felt a sick satisfaction as Rachel shifted in her seat, unable to make eye contact with him or the judge. The battle was now about his son, and he wasn't going to let Rachel take him away. Rachel's lawyer, visibly rattled, tried to regain control of the narrative. Your Honor, we must remember that these are personal matters. There is no evidence that suggests Mr. Collins is unfit to be a father. What is clear, however, is that Rachel is in an emotional state that requires the child to remain with her. The trauma of this situation is hard on all involved, but we ask that the child remain in the only home he has ever known. But it wasn't about where the child had been. It was about where he would be safe, and Jim, in his heart, knew it was with him. He had been the one to care for his son, to love him, to be there for every moment. Rachel's plans, her betrayal, and her manipulations didn't change the fact that Jim had been the rock for their child, the one constant. As the day stretched on, the arguments grew more heated, but Jim held firm. The lies were exposed, and the truth had taken root. It didn't matter what Rachel's lawyer tried to twist. Jim knew his son's future was in his hands. As the judge called for a recess, Jim stood up, his eyes locked on Rachel for the first time that day. She was no longer the woman he had loved. She was the architect of his pain, and now she would have to face the consequences. The final showdown wasn't over yet, but the first victory was already clear. The truth was on his side. The days following the court's decision felt like a blur, a constant cycle of relief and grief intertwined. Jim had won. He had secured full custody of his son, the child he had raised and loved with every part of his being. But the victory didn't feel like the triumph he had imagined. It felt hollow. The fight had been brutal, the wounds deep, and even though the truth had prevailed, the damage to his soul was done. He stood in the kitchen, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as he stared out the window, the soft hum of the house around him. The silence was suffocating. His son was playing in the other room, his laughter a distant reminder of the life Jim had fought so hard to preserve. But it was hard to shake the feeling that everything was different now. His life was no longer the same. Rachel was no longer the woman he had loved. Rachel. The name echoed in Jim's mind like a bitter taste he couldn't wash away. The aftermath of the court case had left her broken, but it had also exposed her for who she truly was. A woman willing to destroy everything she had for the sake of her own selfish desires. She was gone now, no longer part of Jim's world, but the memory of her betrayal lingered like a dark cloud. There had been no reconciliation, no final conversation between them. Rachel had left the house the day after the verdict was read, taking only a few things. She never said goodbye. Jim had expected her to fight for one last moment with their son, but she hadn't. She had walked away, as cold and detached as she had been throughout the entire ordeal. Jim had tried not to focus on what Rachel was doing or where she was. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was his son, his future. That's all that mattered now. But even so, there was a lingering ache. The person he had trusted most had destroyed their family, and no amount of legal victory could take away the pain of that reality. Later that evening, as the night settled over the house, Jim found himself sitting on the couch with his son nestled beside him. They were watching an old movie, the kind Jim had loved as a child. It was comforting, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jim allowed himself to relax, to breathe. His son reached for his hand and held it tightly. Jim squeezed back, and in that simple gesture he found a new sense of peace. "Are you okay, Dad?" his son asked, his voice small and innocent. Jim looked down at him, the weight of everything still heavy in his chest. "Yeah, buddy, I'm okay. We're okay." His son smiled up at him, and in that moment, Jim realized something he hadn't fully understood until now. He had lost so much, but he hadn't lost everything. He still had the one thing that mattered most. He was a father, and no one could take that away from him. Days passed, and life slowly started to feel like it was returning to some semblance of normal. The constant anxiety, the fear that everything would unravel at any moment, began to fade. Jim began to rebuild, piece by piece. He took his son to the park, started focusing on his work again, and even started thinking about the future, what it would look like now that everything had changed. But there were nights when the darkness crept in, when the silence of the house felt too heavy, when the weight of the betrayal resurfaced, and Jim felt the sting all over again. He would think of the letter Rachel had written, the lies she had told, the way she had destroyed the family they had built. He would wonder what he could have done differently, what he had missed. But he had learned something important through this whole ordeal. The past, no matter how painful, was something he couldn't change. What he could change was the present. What he could change was the future. And for the first time in a long while, Jim felt hopeful. It wasn't the future he had planned for, but it was a future he could face. He had his son, and for that, he would keep fighting for them both.